And we are now live being recorded. After you've completed this webinar with us today, if you're interested and need, for any variety of reasons, a certificate of attendance, we will happily provide that to you for your participation in this 1-hour webinar. If you do need that, please email Barbara, and her email address is bcrawford@air.org, and you're able to request a certificate, and she's just typed that up in the chat pod for everyone too, in case you forget it once the screen scrolls by. So today we're learning about Title IV financial and the Council on Occupational Education process, or the COE process. And we are very, very fortunate to have with us Mr. Dave Williams, who's the principal at Beaumont Adult School, and who has recently gone through this accreditation process. And he is going to share with you today his experience and some helpful information for you as you are thinking about going through this process. Specifically, by the end of this session, he's going to have shared with you what the accreditation process is for COE. He's going to talk to you about eligible COE programs and the benefits to your school. He's going to go through a little bit of the application process so that you know what to expect if you choose to try with going forward with the COE accreditation. And then he is going to share where WASC fits into this process. And at the end of this, he is going to have some time for you to ask questions and answers, and there will be a few times throughout the presentation where you will be able to interact with Mr. Williams and provide some feedback and questions and thoughts on where you are in this process. And then at the very end of the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to download some materials in addition to the PowerPoint itself, which we will make available for you at the end. So with that, I'm done with my introduction and welcome, and I'm going to now turn over to Dave Williams, who is our facilitator for today's webinar. Dave.
Thank you, Cherise, and welcome to everyone. I'm glad to see such a large number here today, and I'm going to make sure this is worth your while and going through this webinar process. We need to go to the, there we come. Just a moment and we'll have the PowerPoint up to begin. As we said, this is the presentation and webinar for the Title IV Financial Aid Accreditation and the Council of Occupational Education, or COE as I'll refer to them for ease of speaking, in that process. And we mentioned the objectives today. To go over to what programs are eligible for COE accreditation, what is the benefit to school to obtain accreditation, what is the COE accreditation process, what is the application process for the accreditation, and where does WASC fit into this. A little bit of background as to why we're even talking about COE and Title IV accreditation. Prior to September of 2010, adult schools and ROPs received accreditation for Title IV federal financial aid through WASC. In September 2010, WASC disaffiliated themselves from the Title IV accreditation process. They listed a number of reasons for that, the primary one being was they felt they could not focus on the academic accreditation because of the compulsory requirements of Title IV accreditation, so they decided not to do that. In order to be eligible to disperse Title IV funds, agencies must have accreditation by a U.S.D.O.E. recognized accrediting agency. You can find a list of U.S.D.O.E. recognized accrediting agencies at the link that's listed on the PowerPoint here. There were, at that time that WASC disaffiliated themselves from the Title IV process, approximately 15 adult schools and 8 ROPs throughout California that were already using Title IV federal financial aid, and thus we had to scramble and find an agency outside of WASC that would meet the needs and criteria of providing the accreditation for Title IV. We found, and Neil Kelly was instrumental in putting together, facilitating a group of the administrators from those schools that had the accreditation. We found that COE was one of the very few agencies approved by U.S. Department of Education that provided accreditation for public as well as for private schools offering career technical education. Basically, we only found one other agency. They were not very cooperative in trying to work with us out here in California in the public schools. There were a couple of agencies that would provide accreditation only for specific career technical education programs such as nursing, but not other areas of career technical education. So the majority of us have decided that we would utilize COE for our Title IV accreditations. Now, first, what is a Title IV eligible program? Since I don't believe any of us are offering degree programs at our schools, in our area, the Title IV eligible programs would be Career Tech Ed certificate programs, but they must be at least 24 semester credits, which equates to 600 clock hours and 26 weeks minimum in duration to be eligible. If your program that you're considering using Title IV for as a funding source is less than that, it does not fall into that eligibility. It is also by definition a post-secondary career technical education program. That means that the applicants or the students in that program must possess a high school diploma or equivalency. There is a loophole to that. It's called the benefit of instruction, where a student could be allowed into a post-secondary program if they show that they could benefit from instruction for that program without the high school diploma or GED. However, there is a very strict testing and compliance criteria by the U.S. Department of Education in order to meet that. And since most of us know that our students would not really be eligible in the job market for most of the career tech ed programs that we provide, we generally tend to stick with the high school diploma or equivalency requirement for entry. You also have to have, if this is the first time you're looking at getting a Title IV accreditation, you must have demonstrated successful operation of the program that you're seeking accreditation for 24 consecutive months prior to the initial accreditation. Once you have the accreditation, if you decide at some point in the future that to add additional programs under that Title IV eligibility, you do not have to show the 24 consecutive months of successful operation, but you do have to do a substantive change to your accreditation and change your application for Title IV with the U.S. Department of Education. If you are not planning on using Title IV funds, there really is no reason for COE accreditation. It is strictly for Title IV programs, and if you're looking for academic or other accreditation, COE would not be the one to do that. Potential benefits to your schools. Once you're accredited for Title IV and your application for that has been approved by the U.S. Department of Education, basically your application upon approval gets you a number from the U.S. Department of Education that can be entered into a FAFSA for a student seeking federal financial aid, and that will show that your school is eligible to receive those funds. So you will be able to order and disperse funds from Pell Grants and federal student loans to your students. I know a lot of the adult schools and ROPs are only using Pell Grants to supplement their students in the financial aid, primarily because there is no payback required under Pell Grant. However, once you have Title IV accreditation, you are fully eligible to do any of the federal financial aid programs, the same as any of our colleges or universities that offer those programs. The current Pell Grant maximum amount is $5,500 per academic year. Okay, an academic year is slightly larger than that 600-hour, 26-week minimum that I mentioned as being eligible for a program. It's actually a minimum of 900 clock hours. If you have a program such as a vocational nursing program, it's possible that you could actually have the course of instruction over 2 academic years, and then students would be eligible for that maximum Pell amount depending upon their financial need for each academic year. So they could actually, in a 2-year program, receive a maximum of $11,000 in Pell Grant. Student loan maximum is entirely dependent upon the program's cost of attendance, and that does not mean just the cost of tuition and fees and materials. There is a whole formula that goes into that in terms of they're considered full-time students, so there is a certain amount of support that's required in terms of housing, food, transportation, materials that is outside of the program cost. So cost of attendance may be considerably more than just the tuition and fees of a program. What I'd like to do right now before we go into, and I talk a little bit about what we're doing with the Title IV to show some of the advantages of the using the program. There's a chat pod on your screen, and I'd like to know what CTE programs are you considering if you're looking at potential COE accreditation for Title IV. Okay, I see Melanie's got LVN and welding. The LVN program, and we'll go into a little bit in terms of what's required for the application process in addition to being just meeting the minimum eligibility. The LVN and most nursing programs are covered under a state licensing or state certification process. In the case of LVN, the State Board of Vocational Nursing and Psychiatric Techs has to certify you to be able to offer the program. Now, for programs such as welding, medical assistant, pharmacy tech, there is some certification, but it's generally an industry level certification, and you'll need to show as part of the accrediting process that your program meets or exceeds those industry level certifications in order to grant a certificate. Again, in the case of most of the nursing ones, pharmacy tech, LVN, some of those, that there are very specific requirements in terms of a certificate of completion, but you'll need to look at what is the industry standard, or if there is any state standard. Graphic design, web design, very interesting, a very good program. Again, you'll need to look at if it leads to a certification such as a Microsoft Office or other recognized industry certification in there in order to be eligible for the program. Quite a wide variety of programs that you're looking at offering in there. It's excellent, excellent. CNA I see down there, and on a couple of them, I'll talk a little bit more about CNA. Because our school is offering that also, and there is some particular, I won't say difficulties, but some unusual circumstances that we found in getting our CNA program approved for Title IV, but it is possible, and you can get a CNA program that is approved under that. So very good. I see that there's quite a wide variety of programs that people are considering offering. In our case at Beaumont Adult School, we're actually a really small school. Our last 2 years, our ADA, if we were counting ADA, would be about 250 ADA per year. On the last base year that we were granted ADA under the state formula, we were funded for 196 ADA. As you can imagine, it being that small, it's rather difficult to run CTE programs. Our general adult program is pretty much the same as everybody else, ESL, adult basic, and a secondary education with GED and high school and parenting programs, and particularly parental involvement in our district. The CTE programs that we offer, both under Title IV accreditation and financing, are an LVN program and a CNA program. As I mentioned, because of our size, when we started the LVN program about 6 years ago, we really did not have sufficient ADA to cover the instructional period for LVN, so it was much more a matter of covering both instruction and materials and fees through tuition and fees rather than using state funds for the instructional part. Because of that, we offer not only the Pell grants for the LVN program, but the federal student loans in order to allow our students to pay a tuition and be able to participate in the program. Our CNA program was very recently added as part of our switch to the COE accreditation. We included our CNA program, and we do only use Pell grants for our CNA students. for pretty much the same reasons that many other schools only use Pell Grants. They're not a really extremely high-paying position upon entry into the healthcare industry. Most of them would not have the ability to repay student loans, so we try to keep the program cost at about the amount that's available under CN for Pell Grants for CNA. When I mentioned it, it was interesting. When we added the CNA program into our Title IV eligibility, the U.S. Department of Education balked at our change in application because the state requirements for CNA for California are a minimum 140 hours, which is well below the 600 hours required for Title IV. For a number of years, we had offered the CNA, but we had also offered home health aide. We had recently added an acute care nurse assistant and a restorative nurse's aide as additional certification programs separate from our CNA. What we did was we took all of those and combined them into a program that we titled Comprehensive CNA and made that a 600-hour, 26-week program. It took a bit of convincing and showing them the industry standards for these additional certifications for a CNA, with CNA being a base for that, but we did finally get approval and are authorized to use the Pell Grants for our CNA program. So there are ways to do that if that's the kind of program that you're looking at. We have a very small older adult program which is fee-based. The point of all this is that our total school budget for this school year is I projected at $2.2 million. Our state allocation of funds that was based on that 0708 196 baseline ADA is only about 20% of our total school budget. Our Title IV funds make up 70% of the school budget, and we get 10% of the budget comes from other fee or grant programs such as the WIA and CalWORKS. Now that's pretty significant, especially in a school in our size. Again, we use the Title IV federal loan program ostensibly for the LVNs to pay for the tuition and the fees. 99%, I could probably put 100, but there's always an exception. 99% of our students enrolled in the career tech ed programs are using some form or variation of the Title IV funding to meet their payment or their fee requirements for our programs. I mentioned we added the CNA program Title IV this year. Because we were running it under state allocation funds before, we were only able to run one instructor one class at a time, which was a 15-to-1 student-teacher ratio by state requirements. But because we're doing it under Title IV, we've been able to add an additional instructor for the clinical programs and increase the students to 30 per class and schedule the program year-round. Because we depend heavily upon the CTE programs in terms of funding the school, we find it is necessary to get the information out there for the prospective students to know about the programs and to be able to apply to the school. We advertise our programs through most of the traditional methods: newspapers, brochures, flyers, local job fairs, district school events, and all of those things that you probably do. But we've recently also started advertising our programs through social media such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, since one of the primary demographics that we're looking at for our nursing programs are in the 20 to mid 30-year-old range. We find that most of them don't read newspapers and don't even when they listen to the radio, it's their iPod, but they do participate in Facebook and Twitter. And so we're actually seeing our enrollment increase, or at least our applications increase considerably by using those social media factors. Hey, be aware the COE has strict rules on how you specify their accreditation in your school advertisements. Similar to those, if you've been WASC accredited, they have standards on how you present that accreditation in your advertisement. COE is very similar. Again, 99% of our students enrolled in the CTE programs use Title IV funding to some degree. And the community and regional recognition of the advanced accreditation has been a huge factor for our staff and students. on being able to advertise the school as offering the same Title IV federal financial aid as a community college gives a great deal of status to the program and to our staff and students, and it becomes recognized as we go through different clinical facilities and when we discuss our adult school with the district and our community. So there is an advantage there in terms of recognition for getting that accreditation. Now, the COE accreditation process itself. Now, remember, as I mentioned, there's no need to do COE unless you are seeking the Title IV accreditation. But if you decide to seek the COE accreditation, first you submit a letter of intent to seek candidacy. Their first step of the process is an acceptance to candidacy. When you submit the letter, you'll make contact with them. They are very, very accommodating and are great at providing guidance and information and answer all of your questions in terms of going through that process. You will then prepare and submit a candidate application. That candidate application must include the application fee, the dues for the first year of the accreditation, and a site visit deposit. Okay, it must also include audited financial statements. Some of you, even if you're currently running CTE programs, depending upon your financial arrangement with your districts, may or may not be getting annual audited financial statements for your CTE programs. We found that to be one problem when we were first doing the Title IV under WASC, and we had to make special arrangements with our district to provide for annual auditing of our program as a separate program and not just included in the district's audits. A copy of the state license. That was where I was talking about if there is a program that requires state certification, such as a nursing or healthcare program, you would want to have a copy of the authorization from the state for that. That also states, if you look at the application, your license as a school. That is not applicable to public schools. That is primarily for private schools, which generally have to have some license to operate under a state consumer bureau or some other agency similar to that. You will then host a site visit for that acceptance to candidacy. This is usually a 2-day, 2-person visit about 4 to 6 weeks after your application is received by COE, unless you are a really, really extensive school with a program that covers a vast amount of remote sites under CTE. It'll generally always be the 2-day, 2-person visit. Once they've returned their report, and they'll give you a basic rundown of what they're going to return back to the to COE, the commission for COE will approve your candidacy. They meet at specific times of the year similar to the WASC Commission. The votes on the candidacies and accreditations occur in February, June, September, and November each year. An approval of an acceptance to candidacy provides you 3 years of accreditation based upon that acceptance. Prior to the end of that 3 years, you must get a full accreditation, very similar to the interim WASC accreditation process, and then a regular cyclic accreditation. You will be required, and it'll be, I recommend that at least 2 people from your agency, but it is required that at least one attend a candidate academy workshop, which is always held in conjunction with the semi-annual COE conferences. They are held in July or November each year in various locations. In November of 2010, they happened to hold their academy and their conference in Phoenix, which was very close. So a number of schools in Southern California sent their people for that candidate academy there. Then they held one in San Antonio this past summer, and I believe they also had one in Miami. So they move around quite a bit, and they're not in generally small locations. But you will have to bear the cost of sending a minimum of 1 person to the Candidate Academy workshop at one of those 2 points in the year. You will then prepare your institutional self-study report, very similar in general to a WASC self-study. You will submit that to the COE. You will host a preliminary school visit by the team leader. That's similar to the WASC chair pre-visit to the site to ensure that everything is ready for the visitation committee. Then you will host the accreditation team visit on the actual site visit to go through the self-study. They will provide you a report, preliminary report coming out of that visit, and you will be allowed to prepare an institutional response to the team report. Now, if you're not familiar with the Title IV accreditation, it is vastly different than the academic accreditation normally done under WASC, or what was previously the focus on learning from WASC. The WASC accreditation was very much the school's strengths and weaknesses, what your action plan was to correct the weaknesses in terms of meeting student achievement goals, etc. That's not the case in Title IV accreditation. In Title IV accreditation, there are 10 standards that must be met under the accreditation, and it is very strictly in compliance or non-compliance with those 10 standards. If the accreditation team visit comes up with any of those standards that is not considered in full compliance, they will provide you with that report, and you will have an opportunity to prepare an institutional response to that team report, and that it will be sent to the commission along with the accrediting team's visit, because it's basically an all or nothing type of accreditation. You must show that you are fully compliant in all 10 standard areas in order to receive the commission's accreditation. There are actually 11, and if you are doing any or planning any distance learning career tech ed programs, there is an 11th standard that applies only to distance learning programs. In our case, we don't do that, so we only go by the 10 standards that the commission and COE require. It's a basic timeline here to give you an idea in terms of that process. You would start with the letter of intent, then you would submit your application for candidacy, host the 2-day site visit, and then it goes to the commission for approval depending upon the time of year it was submitted and one of those time frames that they meet. You then would have a minimum of one person attend the COE workshop in either July or November for accreditation and candidates for accreditation. You would then begin to prepare your self-study report. You would host a preliminary visit by the team leader for the accrediting team to ensure that everything was ready and that you were fully prepared for the accreditation team. That team visit would occur. You would get the report out from that, and then the commission would vote on an approval of your accreditation, again in the same meeting time frames as the candidacy was in order to achieve that accreditation. Again, the COE does not provide accreditation for academic programs, and we'll talk a little bit about where does WASC come in if you have or desire an academic accreditation to go along with your CTE Title IV accreditation. The cost of accreditation, it's fairly significant in terms of what most of us are used to. The application fee is $1,500. Annual dues for your accreditation are based upon the full-time equivalent for students enrolled in your programs. And those are only the programs to be accredited. You don't have to count the other programs that you have through your schools that are not under the Title IV accreditation process. But an example, there is a table listed in the accrediting manual in terms of the amount of annual dues. If you had 75 full-time students, it would be $2,440 in annual dues. If you had 150 full-time students, it would be $2,650 in annual dues, and those are paid each year, not just the year that you get the accreditation. A candidacy site visit with 2 people is about $3,600, and I base that on the cost that we had for the candidacy site visit that we had last May from COE. Those people, the visiting team for COE will probably come from the East Coast. Ours happen to come from Georgia and Tennessee, so you're going to be paying significant travel. You will pay the accommodations while they are there, and provide transportation for them while they're making the visit. We were fortunate in that when we did the candidacy visit, there were 2 other schools in our general area that were also preparing and wanted to have a candidacy approval visit, site visit, and we were able to combine the visitation team with the other 2 schools, so that each one of us only paid 1/3 of the cost for that candidacy site visit. Again, COE was very, very accommodating in making arrangements such as that, and trying to make sure that the schools did not incur any more expense for accreditation than what was absolutely necessary. So that was great of them to be able to do that, and saved us quite a bit of money. Your initial accreditation visit fee is $1,000. You can figure that an initial accreditation site visit would be at minimum of twice the cost of a candidacy visit, because of the increased number of team members that would be coming. Again, dependent upon the size of your programs in school, there might be between 4 and 6 or slightly more team members that would be coming to do the accreditation. The accreditation visit time is usually 4 days, very similar to WASC accreditation in terms of length of time. And the way that they approach the accreditation visit is very similar to WASC accreditation visit, again, with the emphasis being that you're either in compliance or not in compliance with the 10 standards for accreditation. I mentioned that for about the 3rd or 4th time that COE does not do academic programs. Okay, in our case, we actually had the WASC academic focus on learning accreditation before we did the Title IV accreditation. It is our desire, because we have the high school diploma plus our other academic programs, to maintain our WASC academic accreditation. And so where does WASC and COE fit in with each other? Well, we were very fortunate in that after a number of schools began looking at COE and this accreditation for Title IV process, WASC was able to agree to or meet a memorandum of agreement with COE, and they are able to provide co-accreditation for schools requesting that based on the single COE visit. So it is possible, if you have a WASC accreditation and wish to maintain that, you can do so as a co-visit along with your COE accreditation. WASC will look at your academic programs. COE will not. Under the current part of the Memorandum of Agreement, WASC has agreed that schools do not have to prepare 2 self-study reports, although there are significant differences between the WASC Post-Secondary Schools Accreditation Manual and COE. They are looking at the programs in terms of the requirements under COE, although again you'll find many of the financial ones don't apply to your academic programs. That's an evolving process, because this is actually the first year that WASC and COE have started that process, and there's only been a few schools that have done that so far, but most of them that are scheduled for this year are doing it. There will be 1 or 2 people from WASC as part of the accreditation team, and they will be the ones that will look at those academic programs while COE looks at the career tech ed programs. You need to inform WASC and COE of your intention to have a dual accreditation. You'll do that in your letter of intent, and it will also ask you again about it in your application for candidacy. COE will ask that you send letters to WASC and to the U.S. Department of Education indicating your intent to have dual accreditation. Although the WASC one doesn't apply to Title IV, it is part of the process. This is the COE point of contact for schools that are seeking their initial acceptance to candidacy. They actually have separate offices at COE in terms of who handles schools in what category. Alex Wittig is really a really great guy. He is the Associate Executive Director for COE, but his primary concern is being in charge of schools that are doing their initial application for candidacy. So he will be your direct point of contact for you and your school going through that initial application for candidacy process. Once you have achieved candidacy, there is another person at COE that is the primary point of contact for schools that are in a process of scheduling their initial accreditation visit as a follow-on to that candidacy acceptance. And you'll be placed in contact with them after you go through the process. But Alex is willing to answer any of the questions that you have and get you in touch with the right people at COE. Again, we found them to be extremely accommodating. They actually had private schools and some government schools that were not necessarily public schools, but related to military or law enforcement agencies in California that were accredited before we began looking at this process as public schools. So they were actually excited to be able to expand their area of influence in Title IV accreditation in California. So they have been very good to work with from everyone, from my standpoint and from all the schools that I've had contact with on this Title IV process. The COE documents that I recommend that you refer to in terms of your decision to apply for candidacy and go for the Title IV accreditation, and I understand that CalPro will be providing these to you as downloadables at the end of this webinar. The application for candidate for accreditation, there is a link there that they are downloadable. The self-study manual and handbook of accreditation for COE, very similar in nature to the WASC self-study manual and handbook of accreditation, but again with those different stipulations for Title IV. Is there any questions? I've popped up a chat pod there for closing questions. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them for you. I want everyone to understand that this is just the very first part of the Title IV process. Once you get this accreditation and receive and actually go to do your application with the U.S. Department of Education, there is a great deal more processes involved with doing the application, getting the U.S. Department of Education to accept your application, required trainings under U.S. Department of Education to be able to administer Title IV funds, including Pell Grants, and ongoing regulatory compliance. Probably something that if everyone is looking for more information would have to be another 1 or 2 possibly webinars because of the extent of that information. So this is just the first step in the process in terms of getting that Title IV accreditation. How do we establish fees for our CTE programs, and how do we pay the teachers? That's a good question. We went through a number of variations in terms of establishing our budget when we were first starting the LVN program. Now basically we have it down to we look at the cost of the program both in teacher salaries and other overhead costs, including advertisement, all of those things in the program. We work that out on a per student basis based on an hourly instruction rate. It's not unlike the old revenue limit under ADA, only you have to look at your program costs, and I know that's hard to do in the first year or so of establishing a program. And when we started using the fee-based, we were looking at some of the ROP fees from areas similar to ours in Southern California and using those and then adjusting from that. If you're just starting a program, I do caution you that because it is difficult to accurately predict the cost of the program, that you would have to have some sufficient reserve in order to establish that program before your funding stabilized. We pay the teachers through the district the same way as the regular adult ed teachers. Our teachers are employed under the adult school. All of our teachers are on an hourly basis. We established a salary scale separate from the district that we're part of because of the differences between adult ed and regular K-12, but we actually have a special category, especially for our LVN instructors because of their high degree of qualifications and demand in the industry, and they are paid at a level commensurate with those qualifications. So what do we charge for the comprehensive CNA program? Basically, it's $3,500. It works out to under that $5,500 per academic year, prorated for a 600-hour program, that the maximum amount of a Pell is just about $3,500, and that's what we're currently operating the CNA program under. For our LVN program, because it is a 17-month program with a much higher cost, the instructors have higher level qualifications. That for the entire program, for both academic years of the program, is about $28,000 per student. That's where that $2.2 million comes in terms of operation for our budget for our school, is primarily under the LVN program. Do we need to transition from WASC to COE if you don't want to offer Title IV but are getting referrals through the state ETPL or WIB? No, you do not. If you're not going to offer Title IV, but even though you have CTE programs and are getting referrals from the ETPL and Workforce Investment Board, there is no need for you to transition from WASC to COE. Again, COE is only for the Title IV accreditation. Students in our areas have a hard time paying large amounts, over $1,000 for training for the first 2 years running a program. Prior to being approved for funding, we would have difficulty getting many students who can pay without financial aid. Any suggestions for making it through the first 2 years? Well, I can tell you what we did, and it was not easy. You're absolutely correct. We had the same difficulty. The first 2 years, we actually only ran one class in the first 2 years of the program, under the certification for the State Board of Nursing, that we looked into and were able to assist the students with some of the Sallie Mae loans, which are not Title IV loans. However, we had to lower that cost of the program considerably from what it is today. And it basically, we used up a lot of our state funds and all of our reserve. But we were charging about $6,000, of which most of the students got through Sallie Mae or other personal loans. And I know a lot of our students don't have an excellent credit history, so that was a very, very difficult part of getting enough students into the program to make it feasible to operate for that first 2 years. But that's the way we did it. I would certainly look for any way possible that I might be able to. Can you tell us a little more about what is included in the comprehensive CNA program? Okay, as I said, basically we had the CNA. A minimum of 140 hours under the state guidelines. We expanded that to include additional anatomy, physiology, and medical terminology, and some medical assistant type of information. So we expanded that from 140 to a little over 200 hours. We then added in the home health aide, the additional certification, which again is 40 hours minimum, but you can add to that program to provide additional information to make your graduates more employable. We had an acute care CNA program that we have been running with a local hospital down here in Southern California for several years. The requirement for that was 100 hours of trauma or acute care experience, which we provided at that hospital. We added that in, and then we have a number of skilled nursing and convalescent homes in our area that had their own industry level certification for restorative nurses aid, which was specific to skilled nursing, rehab, and convalescent care. And we took those criteria, which was about an additional 100 hours. put those all together to make it into a 600-hour program and called it Comprehensive CNA. A quick overview of the process of administration for the Pell Grant. Should we expect a new position to monitor it? Yes, I would recommend that you have someone specifically to monitor administration of the Pell Grant funds. That is a very stringent requirement, not that you have a person, but that you do monitor that in such a stringent manner. We did originally, we hired a person who had a vast amount of experience with colleges and higher post-secondary education agencies, who was very well versed in the federal financial aid process. As we grew and the cost of her position was relatively high in comparison, we actually trained staff members and classified staff members under her to be able to handle the administration of Title IV funds, both Pell and federal loans. There are a number of trainings that are available, and the training is free through the U.S. Department of Education based up in San Francisco. There is actually one that whoever is handling the Pell grants and whoever is considered to be the CEO or chief administrator for the program and the school are required to attend. There are other ones that go into more detail in terms of administrating those funds. You only have to bear the cost of travel and accommodation, and the trainings are free. Those fill up very rapidly and are sometimes hard to get, but there's a number of agencies that provide training in federal financial aid. There is a national organization called NASFA, the National Association of School Financial Aid Administrators. It's a little pricey for membership, but the amount of information that they provide once you are a member is really tremendous. They have a local branch in California called CASFA. They do provide financial aid training at various locations around California, at either free at a relatively low cost. You can just pay travel and accommodation. The quick overview of the financial aid process for Pell Grants is once you have your Title IV eligibility and your application has been accepted, you have a FAFSA number for your school. You can then have students complete a FAFSA as part of their financial aid. Pell Grants are entirely determined by student financial need. So it is based upon student income. In the case of students who are under 24, unless they are married or have children, their parents' income figures into that. So there is a process and formula for determining the eligibility for amount of a Pell for each student. That's one of the primary things that the Pell administrator does in working with each student to determine the amount of Pell Grant award that the student is eligible for. Then you also have to do verification of those eligibility and provide that to the U.S. Department of Education. That's done through tax returns, various other documentation to show that they in fact meet that eligibility. And then once that's been determined and the student is accepted into the program, and once they start the program, they have 3 days in which they can back out of the program without incurring any financial liability under Title IV regulations. But then the administrator can order the Pell Grant funding. It is a more or less reimbursement process, so your student will start and you will have to order the materials and whatever else is required for the student to start the program before you actually get the funding from Pell. That's usually in the area of 6 to 8 weeks. It can vary a little bit depending upon the program. They will send the money basically in checks to you or your business services office at the district. And then you account for that by each student having an account receivable in your books to show the amount of Pell that was received for each student. If a student drops or is dropped before completion. There is a calculation that you have to do to show the amount of instruction that the student received. That goes on a daily basis, so it actually is up to the day that they drop in order for you to calculate whether you have to return any Pell funds to the Title IV program, or whether the student owes you money or owes money if there was an overpayment. The overpayment doesn't occur very often, but on occasion might, and the student would be responsible for returning the Pell funds if there was an overpayment. Again, that would be something that is more than even just one webinar in terms of the administration of Pell Grant and Title IV funds. A first step for an agency interested in seeing if this is something they should do. I would look at your overall budget, look at what the funding could do in terms of support your CTE programs, in those programs that could be eligible for Title IV funding. And I would probably try and seek out some agency similar to mine, or at least another adult school or ROP. Whether or not they were the same programs, if they were using Title IV, I would try and make contact with them to see how they were using it and what the benefit was to their school. And then I would inquire with COE and Alex Wittig in terms of the process. Again, they're very, very helpful and can help you through that. And I feel confident that they would also be able to provide you with some advice as to whether or not it might be something that was viable for your particular agency. Where do CBOs fit in? Are they eligible agencies? Anybody is an eligible agency. Most of the schools that are under COE accreditation, and probably throughout the United States outnumber the public schools, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 to 1, are private and in particular for-profit schools and technical schools, and they all can fit into this program also. Again, if you were a community-based organization, even as a nonprofit, you would have to meet the criteria of being authorized under the state of California to offer the Career Technical Education program as a school, and you would have to show that your program met the criteria for Title IV. There is some additional financial statements required in terms of accreditation and being able to show financial stability for agencies that are not public schools, essentially private or even nonprofit, non-public schools. So that would probably be where the CBOs would fit in. Instructors for CNA, clinical, and home health aid clinical need different state required experience. Did you have them on staff already? We had the CNA. We actually did. We had CNA, clinical, and home health aid staff members back when I joined the school 10 years ago, when we were running the program strictly under state funding and not under Title IV. We did have instructors with those credentials. Since we started the LVN program, we found that a number of those instructors that meet criteria for LVN can also meet the criteria for CNA and home health aid, and we actually do interchange them somewhat, although I pay them separately for those different programs, because I have to keep the funds separate and show that they're being paid from the one that they're working for and not the other. You pay CTE instructors at a different level than academic instructors? Yes, we do. We have a contract scale for all of our teachers, and I actually had to include a special column. We term it as a program specialist. We use it almost extensively for our CTE instructors. In fact, I'm looking now, although it's a very bad time in terms of financial matters for all of the adult schools, because we're a bit behind, because we haven't been able to increase pay for the CTE instructors because of district funding freeze, that type of thing. I'm looking at trying to create an additional column of Program Specialist 2, because while it's not required that an LVN instructor be an RN, it helps considerably if they are. And in order to get RNs and attract them in as instructors, I really need to pay them more than I pay an LVN instructor who has only an LVN license as opposed to an RN. So I do need to create another category to even get higher level experienced instructors. I've attracted qualified teachers as well for the VN program. We have a lot of interest in helping, but they don't want to go through all the credentialing requirements for school district requirements. Is there any other route anyone has used to employ those interested? I do not know of any. It is hard. It is something that is really a detriment in terms of getting highly qualified CTE teachers. I'm afraid I don't have any suggestions in that area because we are doing the same thing. And I would certainly be open to see if there was anyone out there that was able to find something else. This has even been exacerbated somewhat by the incoming new adult ed designated subject credentials requirements, and a number of previously credentialing agencies may no longer be offering adult ed credentials because of the change in requirements. So I see our time. Let's see. I 5 questions remaining. I need to finish out the question and answer period to keep our time commitment. Okay.
Sorry, Dave.
That's right. I understand. I was looking at the time myself and realized that we are just running out of time. This is my contact information at the adult school, my email address. I'd be happy to, if I can, answer any of your questions or at least point you in the direction of someone or an agency that can answer them for you. I know there are a great deal of questions and especially as you get into the varied career tech ed fields, the instructor question is a huge issue, and I understand that, really I do. It has not only to do with pay, but the credentialing requirements and meeting those, all kinds of things that impact our ability to get highly qualified CTE instructors in all of these different areas. So yeah, I'm constantly looking for new information and ways to try and do that also. So I thank you all for your time. I really appreciate this opportunity to get that information out there. I recognize that Title IV will not be the answer for every school and every agency. We're all different. But for our school, it's made a tremendous difference. It's actually given us a huge independence from our district in terms of funding. I'm not so reliant upon the state allocation and the district's good graces and their flexibility to provide the funds for those programs. So it can make a difference in your school, but it is a lot of work, and it takes a great deal of effort in order to accomplish that. So again, thank you all for your time.
Dave, thank you so much, and thank you so much to our participants. I know this is a very, very interesting and timely topic that we have, and we are grateful that you shared an overview of the process with us today. And as we've seen with some of the chat information on the side, we are definitely going to look at expanding this series, expanding this webinar, and possibly repeating it. And so, Dave, I hope that we'll be able to rely on you to help us with that in the future. On this last set of chat pods, you will see at the top our webinar survey, and I would ask if you have time that you please take a moment to complete our survey and give us feedback. And then on the second chat pod on the bottom, you will see today's PowerPoint. It's the second item listed there that you can download. And you will also see the COE candidate application that Dave referred to, along with the manual for going through the COE accreditation process and the COE candidate for accreditation site visit. And these are just a few of the items that we thought would be particularly useful and valuable for you as you finished up today's webinar that we found from the COE website. And if you want more information, I think as Dave shared in his answers to questions, please feel free to contact him and then also visit the COE website. I thank you again for your time. We do have other CalPro administrative webinar forum series coming up. Our next one will be on April the 18th, and it will be on student persistence and retention, and it will be looking at two programs, one on the West Coast that happens to be a CDO and a literacy program, and one on the East Coast, and what they did in terms of focus groups and listening to their students, in particular male students, and how they're able to keep those students actively involved and engaged in their programs. So I invite you to join that webinar as well. And then if you want to repeat this webinar with any of your staff, we will have this on the CalPro video library available for you by the end of next week, we hope. And you can always go there and repeat this session on your own and with your staff. Again, thank you very much, and if there are any other questions, comments you have, please feel free to type them in the chat pod here. We will leave the course room open for you to communicate with each other for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll be closing the course room. Dave, again, thank you very much, and thank you to the participants. Have a great afternoon.